Hello from St. Thomas Episcopal Church and School in San Antonio, Texas, and welcome to the Kitchen Table Bible Study. This is our second episode, or our second official episode of the background, the Old Testament background for Jesus' teachings. This episode, we're going to look at the Sermon on the Mount. Now, we're going to talk about some of its background, and we're going to dig deeper into parts of it. But let's just face up to the truth here, and that is that we could spend the entire time of Bible study. We could probably spend months studying the Sermon on the Mount. There is so much here. And so if I skip your favorite passage, or if there is something that you think, but Debbie, you missed, well, yeah, I probably did, because there's just so much here, and I'm only going to devote one episode to the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm kind of sorry for that, since there's just so much here to unpack. But let's start by looking at the background of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount shows up in two of the Gospels. It does not show up in John, nor does it show up in Mark. And even there are significant differences between the version in Luke and the version in Matthew. The version in Matthew is, let us call it, the more complete version. If you look at the Beatitudes, there are 8 or 9, as opposed to in Luke, there are 4 of the blesseds and then 4 of the woes. Matthew just talks about the blessed. And that is, by the way, where it gets the name from. Beatitude comes from the Latin word beatus, and that means blessed. And so when it was translated from the Greek, that was the word chosen to represent the word in Greek, which I will not disgrace myself with trying to pronounce for you, but it also translates into blessed. And so from beate, or beatus or beate, that's where we get the word Beatitudes. So that's a little background information on there. This is in Matthew. By the way, we're going to look at Matthew's rather than at Luke's. By the way, Luke's is not called the Sermon on the Mount. It's frequently called the Sermon on the Plain or the Sermon on the Flat Place. And so where did Jesus go to do this? Why did he do it? What's the background here? Well, Matthew basically interrupts the story of Jesus' Galilean ministry that he has started at the end of the temptations and then Jesus' time in Nazareth. And then we see Jesus go and do some healings. And then we see, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, we see Jesus withdraw to the mountain and teach. And so this is just a prominent part of the Gospel of St. Matthew. It comprises 3 chapters, whereas in the Gospel of St. Luke, it's only part of one. So last episode, we dug deeper into St. Luke's version of the temptation and then the rejection at Nazareth. Today we're going to really dig deeper into St. Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount. I just think there's more here that we can unpack. But again, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to hit it all, because there's just so much here, okay? In the main, what is Jesus doing here? He has gone up on the mountain. He has retreated from the crowds, but of course they followed him. So he went up on the mountain and he sat down. When we were in Israel, we went to a high place outside of Capernaum, and a place that would be similar to where Jesus withdrew to, if not actually where he withdrew to. Our guide said that it was probably for reasons of acoustics. I'm not entirely certain I agree, but that's what we were told. And so, but it is very common. You see this over and over again in the Gospels, that Jesus would have withdrawn into the mountain or up into the hills, away from the cities, away from the crowds, to pray and to teach. And so his disciples came with him, and he sat down on the mountain, which was normal. A rabbi would normally sit down to teach, and then he would sit like on a slightly higher place, like on a rock or something like that, and his disciples would sit on the ground. And so By disciples, though, I don't mean the apostles. I don't mean the 12. I'm sure the 12 were there, but this was Jesus' teaching to all of his followers, not just the 12. And so there are a lot of people here. It can be divided into sections, and we are going to look at this sermon in sections. Again, this comprises 3 chapters in the Gospel of St. Matthew. It begins in chapter 5, goes through 6 and 7. And so it's really not until chapter 8 that Jesus gets up and goes and does something else. So he is sitting here teaching for 3 chapters worth. And the real background, just the underlying tenet here of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus taking the teachings of the Mosaic Law, and he is showing how to go deeper with it. This is not just observing it on the surface, but observing it, taking it more inwardly as opposed to outwardly. So we talk a lot about the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So we really haven't talked a lot about who these people were. Well, the Sadducees would have been the more aristocracy, if you will, and there was definitely a division between them and your just run-of-the-mill, everyday fisherman or worker. The Pharisees, that wasn't quite as true. The Pharisees were educated, they were respected and looked up to, but they had their problems too. And by the time we are in Jesus' time, they pride themselves on scrupulously keeping the least little part of the law and getting kind of holier than thou about the whole thing. And Jesus is coming now and saying, yeah, well, that's cool, but if you're not internalizing the teachings, if you're not going that extra mile, then you really are kind of missing the point. And that's kind of the basic thesis of the Sermon on the Mount. Again, we're going to divide it into different sections to look at. The first section, of course, is probably one of the best known, and I really think it's one of the most beautiful, and it has the least callback to the Old Testament, sadly, and that's the Beatitudes. Then he goes into the section of the salt and light section, and he compares his followers to salt and light, and what happens if things don't go well for salt and light. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Then he gets into the law, and this is more the Torah section of it, where he is taking a section of the law and he's teaching on it. And now this is going to hearken much more back to the Old Testament, primarily the Torah. We're going to visit Deuteronomy. Of course, we're going to visit Deuteronomy. We're going to visit Exodus a little bit more because that's where the 10 Commandments live. And we're going to visit Leviticus. And this is interesting, so kind of spoiler alert. Leviticus is going to come up in some of our future lessons. Generally, most of the teachings are going to hearken back to Deuteronomy and probably to Exodus. But they also, to a lesser extent, but definitely to an important extent, they're going to hearken back to Leviticus. Okay? Also, Jesus probably hearkens back to the Psalms more in this section of his teachings than he probably does pretty much anywhere else until we get to the end. And so this whole next section, which is going to be quite a bit the majority of the latter part of chapter 5, almost all of chapter 6, and the first part of chapter 7. So this really goes quite a ways. That he's taking the law and just, I think nowadays you call it deconstructing it, and hearkening back, but then saying, but this is where you really need to go with it. So, okay, I think I have covered most of the background of this. So let's start with the Beatitudes. Also, there was one thing I did want to bring up. Last week, I was teaching from the English Standard Version, this week I'm going to teach from the New Revised Standard Version. A couple of reasons. One is, of course, that's the one we read the most often in the Episcopal Church, the translation that we use. The other one is that a lot of really good study material in this section comes from the Cultural Background Study Bible, and that is not available in the English Standard. It's available in the New International, the New King James, and the New Revised Standard. I think those are the only three translations it's available in. So we're going to read this in the New Revised Standard Version. Also, you'll notice I've got two Bibles on the table today, and this is just basically making things easier for myself. Last time I was going back and forth in one Bible, and it was kind of driving me mildly crazy. And so this time we're going to do the Old Testament readings from this Bible and then stay in this Bible for the Beatitudes. It's the same translation. We're using New Revised Standard for both. So now I think I'm ready to start. Let's get going with the Beatitudes. So when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Okay, so that takes us from about verse 2, chapter 5, verse 2, through verse 12. And so that is the section that is the Beatitudes. Why? Because each one of the lines begins with "blessed are," and then whatever. So, does this ever come up in the Old Testament? To an extent, yes, it does. And actually, one of the places where you'll see this is in the very first psalm, and that's going to be in Psalm 1, verse 1. "Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of the scoffers." Now you notice in this translation, and again, we're still in the New Revised Standard Translation, it says "happy are those," as opposed to "blessed are those." It has been said that the Beatitudes could technically be translated "happy" as opposed to "blessed." And so I'm not quite sure why the translators of the New Revised Standard chose "blessed" for the Beatitudes and "happy" for Psalm 1, but the thought is very much the same. So happy are those, or blessed are those, who do not follow the advice of the wicked. So he's hearkening back to the Psalms. And as I say, the Beatitudes, not the Beatitudes themselves, but the Sermon on the Mount, is probably one of the places where he harkens back to the Psalms a little more than he does pretty much anywhere else. Okay, so let's start taking this apart and looking at it. One of the ones I would really like, I'm kind of checking my notes here to be sure I don't miss anything. Let's talk about mourning. Again, we could take each one of these apart, but then we'll be here all day. So let's look at mourning. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." So we think of mourning as mourning for something that has passed, mourning for a person who has died, mourning for a hope that we had that didn't work out, mourning for a job that we lost, mourning for something. Anyway, so mourning is definitely a part of the human condition. But in this instance, we're not looking at this as "blessed are those who mourn for someone who died." It's "blessed are those who mourn." And the idea here is they're mourning because they feel that they have become separated from God through something they did or whatever. And this is why the mourning. This doesn't really mean mourning for something you've lost, unless you want to consider it, and there is justification for doing so, as mourning for the loss of a sense of innocence or a sense of connection with God. And so that's kind of where that comes from. For they will be comforted. So now let's go take a look then. Where in the Bible does this come from? And actually, this comes from several places in Isaiah. And so let's go back and visit Isaiah, who really... Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking over here, and this is my Old Testament. Or I've got the Old Testament open. So we're going to go spend actually a surprising amount of time in Isaiah. There are several places that we could look here for mourning, but let's start with Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid. So you see that kind of hearkening to that thought of a separation and a reconciliation. And so this is what Jesus is alluding to. There are several other places in Isaiah. I'm not gonna go, touch on each one of them, but let's take a look at chapter 51, verse 3. And okay, of course I would turn too many pages. So 51 verse 3, for the Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all of her waste places and will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. So we see the same idea of the Lord comforting. Blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And there are many passages in Isaiah. I'm not going to do all of them, but that kind of gives you just a little taste of some of these passages that Jesus is hearkening back to. So let's see, what are we going to do next? Let's do meek, because that one a lot of times causes the most difficulty, I think, with 21st century Americans or folks. Because, well, if you're meek, you tend to think of meek and humble, and you keep your head down and you don't assert yourself, and you get trodden over. And it's a very pejorative thought now to us. But what was it in Jesus' time? So let's go take a look at this one. Okay. So, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. There is a little note here that it's possible that it could be translated as something other than meek. But hey, let's just look right there and let's do this. Okay. So the idea, and let's go to Psalm 37:11. I probably should have marked all of these because we're just going to go bouncing back and forth, I think, between mostly Isaiah and the Psalms. 37:11. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity. And this, by the way, Psalm 37 is the exhortation to patience and trust. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. That's how that psalm starts. And so buried in this is another a line just as very similar to what Jesus was saying about, but the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity. So does this mean you're supposed to let everybody walk over you? Not quite. That's not really what it means. The humble, the lowly, and this is really where the kernel of this teaching is dependence on the Lord as opposed to dependence on ourselves. And this is kind of really where we get where that concept of meek comes from. Not that you let anybody run over you or whatever, but that you are dependent on the Lord more than yourself. Now, if you remember last week's Bible study, we talked about that some. And this theme is going to come up over and over again in Jesus' teachings. But in this case, that particular one harkens back to that psalm. Let's see. I could spend all day, I'll be honest with you, I could spend absolutely all day in the Beatitudes, and I'm really holding myself back because I don't want this to go on for hours and hours and hours. Let's see. So let's talk about the pure in heart. So God will bless the pure in heart. So where are we here? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. So where does this harken back to? Well, let's go take a look again in the Psalms. We're going to be going to Psalm 73. Oh, good. I got a little closer that time. So Psalm 73, I say that, here we go. And let me see, Psalm 73, actually, 1. Truly God is good to the upright, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. So you're seeing here that, okay, well, God is good to the upright and to those who are pure in heart. But what if you're not? But this is something to aspire to. And so this is kind of the connection here that Jesus is making. Okay, again, I could stay in this absolutely, in the Beatitudes forever, and I am going to force myself to move along, and we're going to talk about the next section, which is called the salt and light section. So let's talk about the second section after the Beatitudes. And this is the salt and light section. This only comprises, it's a very short section, only comprises 4 verses. This is Matthew 13 through 16. And so this is talking about what his followers are like. If you want to be a follower of his, if you want to follow his teachings, if you are seeking the kingdom of heaven, then you need to be like these 2 things. And so let's start with the first one, which is salt. Okay. And so let's read it real quick. It's only 1 verse. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now for us, this is not an easy passage. And by the way, this passage doesn't really harken back into the Old Testament. We're just going to talk about it a little bit. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to us because we get refined salt. I'll have iodine added to it, but iodized salt. But we get salt from the grocery store. But in biblical times, and indeed in much of the world still, there are 2 ways of getting salt. One is to mine it, and the other is to evaporate seawater. Either way you go, and especially the seawater method, you're going to have other minerals usually in with that salt, mixed in with the salt. Not just the straight sodium chloride for the salt, but you're going to have other stuff in with it, which is one of the reasons Himalayan salt is pink, because it's not just sodium chloride. And so the idea is that if you dissolve that and then leach out the water, the salty water, you're going to be left with just minerals that really don't have any taste. And so you're going to throw them out. That's one theory of it. The second theory is that Jesus was speaking in hyperbole, because how could salt possibly lose its saltiness? It's always salty. So since, if that could be done, then it's absolutely useless. It can't be used for anything else. Which of those 2 interpretations is right? I leave that one for you to decide. I personally like the first one, but let's face it, Jesus frequently taught in hyperbole. So probably the second one is more accurate. But, take that one for what it's worth. Okay, the second part of this teaching is the teaching of the light. And this is the next 3 verses, beginning with verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. So the first thing we 21st century people think is, why would you put a lamp under a bushel basket? And if you did, wouldn't it just burn up the basket? Because we're thinking of like larger oil lamps or a big Aladdin lamp or something like that. And we don't every day commonly see the lamps that they used then. But the lamps they used then were very small. You can see this is like really not even the size of my hand, and I have small hands. So this is a normal lamp in Israel. You would fill it with olive oil and light the wick. It doesn't give a bright light. It gives a gentle, more like a candle kind of one candle power light. So this, you can see that if you were to put this under a bowl or a basket or something, just moving the air across it to do that would blow it out. It would either most likely blow it out, and if not, it would obscure it. And so that's where that idea is coming from, because these lamps were small to begin with. And so there we are. It's these little guys. This is not an antique by any stretch of the imagination. These little lamps are for sale all over Israel. Every gift shop in Israel has them. And I started not to get one, but they're just so cute. How could I not? And so I did. I still need to get a wick for it and actually light it. A totally unrelated note of anything. If the lamp intrigues you, there is a beautiful video on YouTube of Noteworthy, which is Brigham Young University's female a cappella group. They did it, I want to say I think they did it at Christmas of 2023. And they are singing What Child Is This? And then kind of mashing it up with a version of the Ave Maria. And each one of the girls, that they're coming from different places in the set of Jerusalem that's built out in Utah. And each one of the girls is carrying one of these lit lamps, and it's like it's at night, and each one is carrying one of these lamps, and they all converge together and then go to see Mary. It is a beautiful video, and you can see these lamps in operation. It's just gorgeous. So that's a little total digression. Well, let's look at some of the biblical background for the light. So let's take a look at the light of the world. So let's take a look at Isaiah 42:6. Now there's several places where Jesus is hearkening back, but mostly to Isaiah. And so I won't go through all of them, but let's look at chapter 42, verse 6. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. And so you can see where Jesus is pulling this thought from Isaiah. It's just a beautiful passage in Isaiah. So now that kind of concludes our little study on that just tiny section really between the Beatitudes and where Jesus is starting to go into his teachings on the law. So let's go ahead and take a look at the teachings on the law. So one of the things that differentiates, or not, that actually characterizes the teaching on the law is that almost all of it starts with, you have heard that, fill in the blank, but I say, fill in the blank. So as the Beatitudes start, blessed are they, and then for they will, the section on the law starts out, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. So the overall arching theme of this section is that he is taking different elements of the law and saying, this is how you keep these on the outside. But what I'm saying is how you go deeper, how you pull it more inside. So let's start with the first one, which is concerning anger. You have heard it, we are still in chapter 5, but we're going to start with verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go, first to be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. And so let's take a look at where this came from. So let's take a look. This is going to, okay, you remember last time I was saying that a lot of what we were studying in Deuteronomy, I can't even say it, Deuteronomy, was a restatement of the law in Exodus. that this was at the end of Moses' life, and he was basically giving the Israelites a going over of all of the teachings. And so Deuteronomy is almost a restatement of a lot of those teachings. So let's go this time to Exodus then, to Exodus 20, verse 13. So here we are. And this, of course, this section, chapter 20, is the Ten Commandments. And so specifically, verse 13 is probably, well, it's not quite the shortest one. It's the second shortest one. You shall not murder. In fact, if it's frequently translated as you shall not kill. And so that would make it absolutely the shortest one. And so Jesus is saying, okay, Moses said, you shall not murder. I am saying, you can't even get angry with someone. So Jesus is taking it that extra step, just that one more. It's like, yeah, this is how you would keep it on the outside. Outwardly you're not going to kill anybody, but even inwardly, you're not going to be angry. You're not going to get angry with somebody. And so you see, that's the first one. Let's see. Let's go to, what is one of my favorite ones? This one, and we could spend an entire session just on this one section of the Sermon on the Mount. But let's go look at what's called concerning retaliation. And this is also in chapter 5. We're going to begin with verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. This particular passage is, I love this passage anyway, but again, I would encourage you, and I'll put the link, if hopefully I can still find it, down in the description. I've got a little story here that there is a contemplative brotherhood of monks, and they actually practice what's called centering prayer, and so they meditate much the same way Buddhists do. Not entire. I mean, they're obviously Christian, but they have a conference every year, and they invite. This is called the John Main Conference, and they invite a speaker. And several years ago, they invited the Dalai Lama, and what they did, and he agreed to do it, was they gave him passages from the Bible to read and then invited him to comment however he wanted to. No holds barred. Whatever he wanted to say, he could say. And there was something, so they gave him this passage to read and then to comment on. This, he had no preparation. He wasn't prepared beforehand for what he was going to read. They just gave it to him. And there was something about hearing him. Every time I read this passage, I hear the Dalai Lama's voice in my head reading this passage, and then his commentary on it, which is just very beautiful. I wish the entire conference had been recorded and was on YouTube, but it isn't, unfortunately. But this section is on YouTube, and I think it's worth actually going and finding and hearing his commentary on it. But instead of hearing the Dalai Lama's commentary on it, we are going to look at where this comes from in the Old Testament. And remember, I said at the beginning of our study today that we're actually going to talk to Leviticus a little bit. So we haven't really looked at Leviticus much. We are going to a little later, but we really haven't before now. So we're going to look at Leviticus 24:20, because there's really nothing in the Bible, or I'm sorry, in the Ten Commandments that says anything about, well, if somebody, hits you, you hit them back. It doesn't really say that. So where does it say that? Well, let's go take a look at Leviticus 24:20. Oops, wrong page. There we go. So, something, I think I'm going to start just a little bit back from that, okay? Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. And this whole section actually is almost laws for judgment, because, and you can sort of see it knowing what the background is here in the Old Testament, that you have to, desert life is, you're highly dependent on your community. Individual rights, it's not what we think of, what we value. The survival of a person is his ability to survive in the group, his or her ability to survive in the group. And so these laws in Leviticus were set down for, if someone transgresses, then they have to know that whatever they did is going to come back to them in the same measure. You kill, you get killed. You hit someone, you get hit back. So that you know going into it that you cannot disrupt this extremely close cultural group, because if you do, you run the risk of just disrupting that group to the point that no one survives, let alone the person who made the transgression. So now we're taking this from Leviticus forward into Jesus' teaching. And we're talking about, well, yeah, you remember that you heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I'm saying that's not going to work anymore. Don't do that. That if someone harms you, turn the other cheek. So this is an interesting passage, because it sometimes is used to justify, everything from, say, Gandhi would have used it for nonviolent protests, to as a justification for running over somebody, because, well, they shouldn't come back at me because Jesus said don't. Well, that's not what that meant, but it meant okay, we got to get beyond this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing. And so this is where it came from in Leviticus and why, and then Jesus taking that same passage and saying, you have heard this, but I'm saying you've got to go the extra mile. So then our last one is, let's take a look at the love your enemies. So let's look at, we're going to start with verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and where this one comes from. Again, this is going to be in trusty Leviticus. And so we're going to go over to chapter 19, verse 18. Actually, I'm going to start a little bit earlier on verse 17, kind of give you a little bit of context here. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay. So on first blush, this is saying, oh, well, it's saying the same thing Jesus is. Not quite. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. Jesus is saying, you're not going to hate anybody. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. By the way, keep this verse, Leviticus 19:18, in the back of your mind, because you're going to see this coming down the road. So I think that we are going to stop with this part of the Sermon on the Mount. And that's going to be enough for the day, because our next section of it, and this is the beginning of chapter 6, is where we go into the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus gives the Lord's Prayer. And we'll take that up in our next installment. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.